the JavaScript bundle size turned out not to be the biggest problem at Facebook because application code weighed so much more than library code.
Why did it take 2 years for React Server components to be made available for use in production?
Yep.
And why does it rely on Next.js to take full advantage of these?
The reason it took so long to develop was because every test we ran with React Server components, it was like worse performance-wise. If you're a startup and you're trying to move quickly and you're trying to test whether or not your product has product market fit, and you think you need an app for that and you can't use the web, and you're not using React Native, I think you're just making your life much harder.
So Tom Occhino is here. He helped to create React and React Native about a decade ago.
Yeah, about a decade now.
And he also served as the manager of the React group, which oversaw the massive open source project that is React.js and also an internal tool for your project infrastructure team. Yeah. And I'm especially delighted to have him here with us today because this was Tom's first public interview since leaving Facebook in 2021. Right.
Gloves are off.
So this is really the first opportunity, publicly anyways, for him to address the entirety of his tenure at Facebook. And so I'm especially honored and absolutely delighted to welcome you, Tom. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
It's really good to be here.
It's good to have you here. Now, there's a lot I want to cover in this 45 or so minutes that we have, including that famous full rewrite of the largest application in the world to React.js. But I first wanted to reflect on the bigger picture.
Sure.
So from your perspective, and with the benefit of hindsight, how did React change the nature of web development?
That's a really good question. Full disclosure, Ben did not in advance give me any of these questions, so this is going to be all off the cuff, and we'll have some fun. Feel free to heckle if you'd like. Look, we saw something really interesting at Facebook around the time that we started working on React, which was as our products got more and more complicated and as our teams got larger and larger, it just became really hard to add new features and fix bugs. And our ability to move quickly became sort of a function of how many people that built the original thing are still available and are around. And I think one of the big things that React did, at least for us internally, was it decoupled initial authorship of an application from the iteration on top of that thing. And I think actually that has more to do with the architecture of a React app, breaking things down into small components that are, responsible for their own thing and that can be then, composed together. I think was just a better architecture. So on the one hand, I'd say like for us, it changed the nature of like how we iterate on, add features to, fix bugs in our applications. It made our apps a bit more reliable, and it was a bit more fun for developers, especially compared to the things that we were using beforehand. There's another interesting thing I think that happened with React, though, especially post-adoption. So I won't say post-open source because there's a whole story about open sourcing React. But I think like as everything kind of started shifting towards mobile development because of time spent on our mobile devices just going through the roof, I think like web development started to almost languish while all of the best and brightest in the industry started focusing all of their attention on idiomatic platform native development for iOS and Android. And I think one of the things that I saw happen with React in the web ecosystem was there was almost this like new spark of like, wow, this is fun, this is cool, this is interesting again. And you almost saw people gravitating back towards doing web development because it was fun and exciting again. And I think, without something like React, I don't know that we had that sort of like resurgence of the web that we now see with, all of these different, companies building cloud-based infrastructure and all this other stuff. So there's kind of like two sides to it, but yeah, it definitely changed things.
I think the developer experience is huge. Yeah, I have a friend who learned React in a weekend at a hackathon, or actually probably in an hour or two. Yeah. And then he worked on it because he was very experienced with JavaScript, very experienced with jQuery. But he comes across this React thing. It's incredible, right? So he falls in love with it. I fall in love with it. And a couple weeks later, he's having a job interview. and he convinces his boss, literally over the phone, hey, I'm going to rewrite your entire jQuery app, 10,000 lines of jQuery in React. Boom, sold, he gets hired, and he does exactly that. Is then promoted a year later to the director. So the developer experience is huge. What about the user experience? How did React change the user experience?
Yeah, great question. I think, the goal has always been a good developer experience in service of delivering a great user experience. And I think the way that you deliver a great user experience, not all companies, not all individuals believe this, but I believe the way that you deliver the best user experience is by being able to iterate on it very quickly. When something is wrong, you can fix it very quickly. When you need to add a new feature or take it in a new direction based on new information that you've gathered since you rolled out your first version, you can do that very quickly and you can do it with confidence. And so I think one of the biggest things we focused on was making it so that our applications were easier to iterate on. And as a result, I think we produced better user experiences, certainly than the set of technologies we were using before that. And additionally, as our teams got bigger, because we needed to add more and more features, the application didn't break down in the same way. So I think initially it was about more reliable, fixing bugs more quickly, adding features more quickly, testing things more quickly with confidence. And then over time, once we had the majority of, or a big chunk of our experiences written the same way using React, then we were able to make large-scale improvements across the board to things like performance or accessibility, or if you're using the same component across a lot of experiences and we make that component more accessible, all of a sudden all of the users of all of these different experiences benefit. So we had a wedge, as they say. I think initially it was around solving specific problems, and then it became our wedge to solve other problems in the user experience.
And you mentioned the tools that preceded React, and I want to talk a little bit about that because I think React has been around so long that some of us might have forgotten what it was like before, or in many cases, they're too young to even know.
Yeah.
So can we talk about those tools? Because you were a big part of that, about at least one of them.
Generation one of the JavaScript libraries. Yeah.
Generation one, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, I mean, in the before days, one of the big problems that JavaScript libraries were trying to solve was the fact that browsers were all different. And so, if you're trying to build for most users, they're going to be in one of a couple different browsers. And for a while, it was just everyone's in Internet Explorer. And then for a little while, it was Internet Explorer and Firefox. And eventually, Chrome came along. Safari was in there as well. And so the first generation of JavaScript libraries was like, OK, we're going to give you some APIs that you can use to do the thing that you want to do without worrying about the difference between the selection API in Microsoft Internet Explorer versus the selection API that's standard in Firefox. And paper over, basically, and abstract away all of those things. And so one of those libraries was called MooTools. That was the one that I and a few others from the React community contributed to. But the big one was jQuery. And the jQuery way of doing things was, quite honestly, pretty incredible at the time. The thing that I was excited about with those libraries was you didn't need Flash anymore to make interactive, pretty great feeling experiences, especially with little animations and things like that. And as an individual building an experience, you could move really quick with jQuery. The whole mantra was write less, do more. And it was fascinating. But then you look at the code that you wrote and you're 3 months later, or even 3 days later in some cases, you didn't really understand what it was doing. It was all about very efficiently writing a small amount of code that did some pretty amazing stuff to your page. But it didn't scale well to teams. So then we saw this sort of second generation come along. And it wasn't just about enhancing the browser's capabilities and papering over the differences between browsers anymore. Now it was about, wow, we're building real applications, and we need to structure those things with computer science, And so you saw this proliferation of these MVC frameworks, or Angular's was MVVM, Model View View Model, or maybe actually it was Model View whatever, MVW. We don't care which, but you're going to structure it this way.
MVC?
There was Model View Controller, and then there was Model View View Model, and then there was Model View whatever, was I believe the Angular one. And those frameworks, you may remember Backbone, you may remember Angular, you may remember Ember. Those frameworks allowed you to build a bit more serious of a web application. And they always had some templating solution that would allow you to get views on the page. And then those views would need to be modified. And so I would say like the next generation 2 of JavaScript libraries was, let's call them the MVC libraries, Backbone, Angular, etc. And then, I forgot what the question was, but I'm going to keep going. Then you had version 3 of the JavaScript libraries, which I think was kicked off with React, which was this realization that not only are we building real applications now, and not only do we need to paper over browser differences, but mutation's really hard. And anytime our data changes, to have to go in and manually update these views or have a templating library update the views for us, it's kind of crazy. And so the sort of like aha moment at Facebook was it became really hard to manage all of the models that were responsible for the views in the ads create flow, or the advertiser management tools we had at Facebook. And one of the things we realized was like, we have this code that initially renders this thing based on any data in any state, and any, now we call them props in state, but we have this code that initially renders the thing. And then when we change something, because we want this to be all client-side and fast, we go in and we tweak all these things and we let the models do their cascade of updates, and then we update the UI and it's really crazy. And we're like, well, what if we didn't do that? What if we just blew the thing away and we just re-rendered everything from scratch based on that code path that we already had? And the story that I told a while back was like, for the chat buddy list for a little while, I'm pretty sure, Adam Wolf, keep me honest, we just blew away all the inner HTML and just re-rendered the whole thing from scratch, because anytime a buddy came online, to find that node and then change the thing to green and then resort the list, it was so much work. So we just started out by saying, we're just going to blow the thing away and re-render it from scratch. And then we found all the places where that would break down. Okay, it breaks down if you have some text selection. It breaks down if you have some state in the DOM, like text in an input or a select box focused or something like that. And so React was an exercise in figuring out how we can conceptually have this idea of blow it all away and re-render it from scratch, but a little bit more efficiently. And so I would call that the third generation of like JavaScript libraries. So what was the original question, so I can try to answer it with that context?
A history lesson is all I was
Oh,
asking
great,
for,
history
which is
lesson.
what we got.
Yeah, that's pretty good. At Facebook specifically, we had a client-side MVC framework called Bolt. It was open source for a little while. It was pretty good as those frameworks go. I think, we had the best parts of a lot of different frameworks, and it was integrated into our infrastructure, and it looked pretty good. Excuse me. And, when React came along, it was a really different way of doing things. It was very scary. But eventually, and you'll hear more about this in an upcoming React documentary in February, the creator of Bolt saw the light as well. And he kind of got on board and he was like, wow, this is fundamentally different, and if it works, it's going to change everything. And so he became a sort of vocal advocate internally for React. So imagine the creator of one framework saying, yeah, no, that's not it anymore. This is it. And so that's kind of what happened, at least internally at Facebook over those years.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little more about that, because we know that the external reception to React was not very positive when you first gave your talk. What was it? JSConf EU or something like that?
JSConf 2013. I think it was like May of that year, because EU was like September or later in the year, yeah.
But what was the reception like when you discovered this and started working with it internally? Was there general excitement? Was there like, what the hell is this?
I mean, it was pretty similar skepticism,
yeah.
But for different reasons. I think one of the things we learned internally when we were talking about this was we had to be really clear about the problems that we were trying to solve, but we didn't really need to tell anybody about, the syntax just made sense to Facebook employees. And then we didn't really apply those lessons when we open sourced it and we started talking about it publicly. Rather than talking about the problems that we were trying to solve, which is every conversation we had internally about React, we just showed the syntax. And we were like, oh, here's what it does and how it works. And everybody was like, what? I don't fault or blame anyone for the reception. I think our messaging was kind of wrong. Luckily, we had a second try at it later this same year. Pete Hunt spoke at JSConf EU and gave a talk called Rethinking Best Practices. And that was the one where I don't even know if he showed any React code. But what he did do a very good job of is talking through the problems that we experienced and why we saw this thing that we released as a strategy for mitigating many of them. But internally, full disclosure, when Jordan Walk brought this thing over to my desk, I was like, go away. Like, we don't need another client-side rendering framework. We're not going to be writing JavaScript. I was at the time the person at the company who, during your bootcamp class, which was your first 6 weeks at Facebook, I was the JavaScript person that told you not to write JavaScript. I showed everybody all of the APIs that would make it so you could have interactivity on the page without writing any JavaScript, because we were shipping too much to the client. It was too hard to maintain. It was too buggy. So let's just not write any JavaScript. So when Jordan Walk showed me React, I was like, look, it's interesting, but like, we've tried this before. We're not going to do it. But then I gave it 5 minutes, and I
Just
used
5
it.
is all it took.
Well, that's the expression. But I played with it a little bit in a sandbox he'd made for me, and that's when I realized this is not just another client-side JavaScript MVC. This is the third generation, or the basis for the third generation of JavaScript libraries. Yeah.
So 10 years on, are you as excited about React and the future of the web as you ever have been?
Yeah, perhaps more. I think especially right after we open sourced, it wasn't clear that it would matter. We knew we had something interesting. We knew that it would solve some problems for us, and it was. We were using it in production before we publicly talked about it. But wow, the thing I told the team when we open sourced React for real was, that was a big milestone for us. We should celebrate it. But what's more interesting is what happens next. And what happened next was everything. Everything that was created to solve the problems that React didn't solve itself, because it was a library, not a framework. Everything, from the state management libraries like Redux, to the routers like React Router, to the entire companies and industries that have been built around this thing. None of us saw any of that coming. And it's been really exciting to watch that evolution. But perhaps more exciting than that, the day that Swift UI was released, I wrote Jordan Walk and I said, congratulations, man, you did it. Because for the rest of our lives, no software engineer will ever have to think about the class of problems that we fought with for so many years with frustration about managing mutations on the client of your view state. But for everything before that, that's how it was done. I remember writing ball world in Java and CS 101, and you had to find the ball and set its color to red on click, and it was just no more. Swift UI, Android Jetpack Compose, and all of the other sort of React-inspired strategies that favored declarative views and immutable concepts and single directional data flow and all of these other concepts, that's just the norm now. So I'm as excited, if not more excited, about what's next.
And where does React Native fit into the future? I think it was Lee who mentioned that React Native hasn't taken off as we thought it might. This is one of the things that excited me most when you announced it in 2015. So
yeah. So
is it messaging? Is it technology? Community? What's
a little of everything. I think the messaging, again, we weren't great at messaging. I think the biggest thing that React Native has done wrong is not understanding the audience that it was sort of marketing itself to. But definitely one of the most controversial technologies of all time. I think if it is communicated about the right way, it is strictly better in many ways in its sort of ideal state, right? And it spent many years not in an ideal state. But it is strictly better than native development in a number of ways that are critically important to companies. And in its sort of unideal state, not polished, very buggy, overemphasizing JavaScript rather than overemphasizing the user experience, overemphasizing the developer experience rather than the user experience. If you communicate about it poorly, then it is a sort of trigger for folks who know better. And in many cases, they do know better. So I think I'm sort of glad that it still has a slow burn of adoption, because it's the thing that helped React so much. But I also think that if you're a startup and you're trying to move quickly and you're trying to test whether or not your product has product market fit, and you think you need an app for that and you can't use the web, and you're not using React Native, I think you're just making your life much harder.
Yeah.
And I can say this now because I think the offering, especially with things like Expo, is actually very good. That said, when we announced it and when we released it, it wasn't very good yet. It was a great idea. and it wasn't a great implementation. So it took a long time to get it to a good place. But yeah, I think it's in a good place now.
What about other frameworks? I mean, now you're no longer at Facebook, so they're no longer paying your bills. You don't have to worry about that. Do you have any thoughts on other frameworks such as Vue, Svelte, Solid?
Yeah, I think they all have a ton of great ideas. And actually, this answer is the same answer that I gave when people asked me about Angular and Ember way back when. I am really glad that React is not the only game in town, because I think like Sebastian, the tech lead of the React team, has gotten more ideas from Svelte and from Vue than anything else. And Jason Miller and the Preact project have really challenged this idea of like, do we need a framework that is as big, or a library that's as big as this, to be able to get most of the benefits of it? And the answer is no. The stuff being done with compiler optimizations in Svelte is fascinating. I think that's great. I think Vue is amazing in its own right as well. And actually, the decision to use one of these over the other now is like, well, you don't have to manually mutate views anymore. You don't have to manually wire all these different things together. So they're just all strictly better than what was there before. So yeah, I'm more of the let 1,000 flowers bloom in the space. Use the thing that your team is best set up to use. I think internally at a specific company, if you're fighting between this strategy and that, or this framework and that one, I think that's kind of a recipe for disaster. And I have some anecdotes, not just from my time at Facebook, but from the famous demise of MySpace, was competing technologies, one being built in LA, one being built in Seattle. So yeah, I think there should be some cohesion within a singular engineering team, but across teams, I think use what helps you get your vision onto people's devices or screens as quickly and as high quality as possible.
Yeah, it's all about the product and the end user experience.
That's right.
Rapid fire question. React, framework or library?
Yeah, we've always said it was a library, but then there's frameworks on top like Remix and Next.
So in December of 2020, Dan Abramov and Lauren Tan announced React Server Components at ReactConf. But on July 20th of this year, 2022, Andrew Clark tweeted the following: I can't be more excited for the upcoming Next.js update. For Next.js users, I think of this as the real React 18 release, the release that finally makes features like suspense and streaming SSR a practical reality.
Yeah.
So talk to me about this discrepancy. Why did it take 2 years for React Server Components to be made available for use in production?
Yep.
And why does it rely on Next.js to take full advantage of these features?
It's a great question. Spicy, too. So the reason it took so long to develop was because every test we ran with React Server Components, internally codenamed Flight, it was worse performance-wise, because the long pole wasn't the amount of JavaScript we were shipping. It was an implementation detail of the way that our servers would call back and forth into Node, or we were running our own JavaScript engine. And so we didn't know that it was going to be better. And it took a bunch of, obviously it took a lot of conviction, but it also took a bunch of experimentation to get that to a place where it wasn't worse. So we were running a lot of experiments internally. And then why was it released with Next first, and how come this doesn't benefit all React users? The realization we had a really long time ago about React was we hit a wall with optimizations that we could make when the server was a black box. I think it was Airbnb and Pinterest released server-side rendering strategies way long ago, but that was the extent of server integration of React. There was never any first-party implementation of anything beyond server rendering. And you really need more than just dumb server rendering in order to change the game, as they say. And so Next was a great place to be able to say, hey, we have control of the server, we have control of the client. Now we can finally get them talking to each other in the way that TRPC users take advantage of and take for granted every day, because you just have both right here. So it took a long time, because though the research was sound, the implementations and the data that we were collecting were saying this isn't better, and also we had a lot of bugs to work out. And then Next, I think, was the first place because there was a bunch of alignment between this sort of like Next.js project and the direction that the React core team was going anyway. And that was like a more viable vehicle to get it out first. I think other frameworks like Hydrogen from Shopify, and then Remix has talked about once it's stable that they will integrate if it makes sense. But yeah, Andrew, he likes to be a little spicy once in a while, but I don't think he intended to in that one. I do see this as just like the first place where you can see all of the vision of React together in one spot.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's a good thing that there are now some developers who are part of the React core team that are not fully employed by Facebook? They're employed by other companies?
Absolutely. That's a layup. Yeah, I absolutely think that, for a very long time we have talked about the wanting to shift the center of gravity for React development outside of just Facebook, because what you've seen and Facebook's been criticized a little bit about is that the development of these open source projects takes the shape of what Facebook's problems are. And so in order to make something that works for more people or works in different contexts, you really do need to have different first party examples, and I think having Sebastian shift and having Brian shift, he's at Replay now, and having more of the core team sort of spread out, but still with all of the institutional knowledge that they have, ramping up other people at other companies, I think is the best thing to happen to the core.
Mm. And going back to React server components, one of the biggest critiques of React has always been the amount of JavaScript that you're shipping to the server, to the user. So in your mind, does React server components put these critiques to rest?
Yeah, I think again, because the specific problems, this is another reason why it's good to shift the center of gravity of React development outside of Meta. The JavaScript bundle size turned out not to be the biggest problem at Facebook because application code weighed so much more than library code. And so it's hard to care about the framework itself being, whatever it was, 30 kilobytes when we're downloading hundreds of kilobytes on every click of application UI. And so I think server components is the first thing that could address that, where now our application code can actually be much, much smaller because all the things that are static, they should always have just been HTML anyway. And server components gets us closer to that. I think that it won't put the framework size to rest, discussion to rest. And so React still won't be the best strategy for mobile web development for especially low-end networks and low-end devices for a while yet. Luckily, there are React-like strategies that are well-positioned, like Preact and like some of these other strategies. But I do think that server components is a step in the right direction where the team is saying, hey, it took us some time, but we hear you. We understand. We really do need to ship less JavaScript. And I said this at one of the ReactConf keynotes, and I addressed a tweet from Alex Russell. And I was like, when Alex Russell says we need to ship less JavaScript, he's right. Sometimes his way of saying it is somewhat off-putting, but he's right. And so I think the team really took that to heart, and I think React Server Components is the culmination of lots of different projects that is finally going to address that, and not just reduce the amount of JavaScript, but change the shape of the curve of the JavaScript that is shipped. So it's one thing to say, oh, we can reduce the framework by 10 kilobytes. It's another thing to say we can change the shape of the curve over time for how much code you're shipping to the client. And that's what I think Server Components is positioned to do. That said, you're going to lead me into the next question. I think there's going to be something about Astro. I mean, there's strategies today to be able to say, oh, I still want to be able to use these various technologies like React or like some other framework, but ship less JavaScript. And I think Astro, Fred's here somewhere. Astro, Fred, raise your hand. No.
He missed his shot.
Astro is one of the strategies that I think is pretty good, especially if you're in a position where you have a lot of React code and you want to ship less JavaScript. You can maybe incrementally adopt. You can build things in Astro and pull things in that were already built in React.
Yeah, the Islands architecture is really exciting. He gave a talk at our meetup a couple weeks ago. When we talked, you talked about how one of the most important things of React was getting developers exciting, shipping things, getting the product to the user, and iterating quickly. And the love that developers have for this is a real key component of that. So if they want to build everything with React, is that okay? Like, are there any instances that you do not recommend that they use React?
Yeah, this is a tough question. I think, first off, I think you have to pick the best tool for the job, but there's a lot of considerations when it comes to deciding what the right tool is. And one of the things that React benefited from in the early days was when it was immature and nobody knew much about it, teams had to really evaluate if it was the right strategy for them. And then a lot of teams decided it was, and many teams decided it was not. But once something becomes the incumbent, all of a sudden, teams benefit from the ability to not have to do those bake-offs. And the problem becomes when you don't think about the technology choice. You didn't choose it. It was chosen for you, or it was just the default. And if you hit a wall sometime, like let's say that you are deploying an e-commerce experience to a poor network environment, and you use this technology that was not well suited to that, you can hit a bit of a wall. So I would say understanding whether or not you will bump up against the known limitations of any technology that you use, it's hard to say with certainty, but it is worth at least thinking about for a couple of minutes. And I think a lot of people will adopt React without even thinking about whether or not it's the right solution, and I think that's just net bad. That said, I do think that it is valuable to not have to do the technology bake-offs, because they waste so much engineering time, not necessarily waste, but they burn so much engineering time. And at the end of the day, many times, preferences guide the decision anyway. So even if you do this bake-off and you have empirical evidence and we're gonna measure all the data, we're gonna measure and then you still end up picking the thing that the person who was leading this bake-off had a preference for. So I think, it is worth considering, what is my total addressable market? Like, what are the problems that I could foresee us running into? Or if I'm migrating from something else, is this really the thing I should be migrating to? Or am I just doing that because it's, the latest and greatest thing, or it's the most popular thing? And then there's, I can keep going on this one, it's a lot. There's other considerations, like if the only developers that are available for me to hire are React developers, does that mean that I should use React just because of that? And for a lot of businesses, that is what makes sense. It makes sense to choose the technology that will enable them to move quickly because there are people who know how to use it. So it is not the right tool for every job. And I understand why people choose it when it is not.
Let's talk about the rewrite.
Yeah.
2018, right? You started rewriting
so
Facebook. They did a full rewrite into React. So tell me about the reasons.
So
Facebook to rewrite.
We had been using React internally at Facebook in a ton of places, and it was sort of in islands of experiences on Facebook.com. It was all of our advertiser create flows. It was all of Messenger.com and all of Instagram.com. But Facebook.com was this hodgepodge of technologies that had been built up over a really long period of time. And we got to the point where it was failing us in kind of two ways. Number one is the experience, the product experience itself was no longer aligned with what people were using desktop web browsers for. So the product is wrong. And number two, the technology was so mishmashed and hodgepodged over 10 years plus of iteration, actually it's probably 14 years of iteration, that it was very hard to introduce anything that would be a delightful product because the technology just didn't support it. So even if you were using React on the homepage, I think the Composer team, the Composer was the what's on your mind box that you'd type into or upload photos, that team spent 3 months working on a rewrite of that thing to make it much more interactive, much more delightful. There was a camera in there if you wanted to upload a photo. There was, drag and drop file uploads. There was, creative tools, etc. And they couldn't ship it because it slowed down the homepage too much, because it was too much JavaScript. So they spent the next 9 months trying to figure out how to bootload that JavaScript and get it only on demand and all this other crazy stuff. So when we had tried to use React to make the product that we needed to be, our legacy infrastructure and the delivery mechanisms for our static resources made it just impossible to do so. So we knew that we needed a new product, but our existing technology stack couldn't deliver it. And we knew that we needed a new technology stack, but we had long since had this belief that you cannot change the underlying technology and the product itself at the same time, because you'll never be able to isolate and identify metrics, shifts.
Can you expand a little more on the product issues?
Yeah, so, okay, great. The biggest problem we had with Facebook.com was, since people were spending more and more time on their phones, their total amount of time that they would spend with Facebook was positive. So it was either they were spending the same amount as ever, or they were spending, potentially even spending more, because now it's so convenient, it's on your phone. But the time that they were spending on web was going down. And the time that anybody, or the number of users people who were only using Facebook on the web was trending towards zero. So what that means was that everybody...
You had a full, amazing mobile app at this point, right?
Yeah, this is long after Lee and the team fixed our mobile issues. But the bigger problem that we saw was that people were using their desktop computers for different things than they were when we built the website. And we identified a bunch of cohorts of users, like, in the same time that Facebook usage on web was declining 20% year on year, YouTube desktop web usage was increasing 20% year on year. So we're like, well, that's where some of our users are going, at least. E-commerce was through the roof. People were doing more and more shopping online on desktop computers than ever before. Gaming was just exploding, and Facebook had basically zero gaming offering on Facebook.com. Long-form communication was up. Administration tasks were flat to up. So there's all these cohorts of users and things that they do on their desktop computers that Facebook.com does really poorly or doesn't do at all. And the other thing that was happening was we were diverging in the product itself, because the technology stack that powered our desktop website was old and crufty, and the technology stack that powered our mobile apps based on GraphQL was where all the developers were spending all their time. So even in a place where we wanted the product to be the same, for example, Newsfeed, I think, probably needs to be on mobile and desktop. The Newsfeed implementation on web was fundamentally different than the Newsfeed implementation on mobile. And for places where we could differentiate, and our desktop experience could be a complement to the mobile experience, we didn't have the technology stack that we needed in order to be able to deliver those things. So the Facebook Watch tab, which was long-form video, we just couldn't build a compelling one on the old technology stack. So we ended up making a case to challenge our existing strategies of only change the technology or the product, and we convinced our leadership to let us change both. And that was the start of the project to rewrite Facebook.com.
Elevator pitch for that? Go.
Elevator pitch for rewritefacebook.com?
for convincing your superior.
Yeah, wow, okay. We need a new product on web, and the technology stack that we have won't support it, so we're going to use the latest and greatest technologies that all of our competitors are using anyway to build a better product for web. I'm sure we had a better pitch than
The technology that all of our competitors are using that we built for them.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think we said it like that. But no, really, it's really hard to change a product, especially at that scale, because you have to think about, what are you giving up? What are the metrics that are going to drop? And one of the most sort of compelling arguments that we made was that we don't want to keep every metric the same between the old site and the new site. What we wanted was, even if some metrics drop, we wanted a new baseline that had a significantly higher ceiling. It was going to be higher quality, it was going to be faster, it was going to be more engaging, and it was going to be useful for people. And we weren't going to focus on time spent. We didn't care, I made the case, that we didn't care if people spent less time on Facebook.com. That's a good thing if they accomplished the task that they came to accomplish. Oh, I need to see where that event is. I need to see where that meetup is. Oh, I need to wish my friend a happy birthday, or I need to post these photos. If you can do that faster because the site is faster, easier to understand, and more enjoyable, that's a win. We don't need you to stay there for longer. So we challenged the idea that we have to keep all of this massive list of metrics neutral across this transition. And the case we made was we want a new baseline for those metrics with a higher ceiling.
So what was your role in all of this?
So I was the directly responsible individual for the rewrite, which involved, obviously, my org was, I called it the React org, because swag was easy. But it was the web core team was half of it, and the React Technologies group was the other half of it. But we had to work with all of the product teams at Facebook. So the way that the Facebook app organization is structured is, the Photos team is responsible for the Photos experience on iOS and Android and web and the backend services, et cetera. The Events team is responsible for their experience on all platforms. So in addition to the, however many people we had in my group working on this thing, we had to collaborate with lots and lots of teams around the company in order to, number one, convince them that this is worth doing, which was significantly harder than it should have been, but we had to actually convince them that they should spend their, precious little resources on web. And then number two, provide them with both the tooling and the support to be able to be successful in building their future product. And the product of this thing, the end result was two things. Number one, it was a new Facebook.com, which is interesting for some reasons. But number two, it was a new foundation on top of which any web experience could be built at the company that was significantly more aligned with the way that the rest of the industry was doing web development. And yeah, we used Relay, and yeah, we iterated on Relay and innovated on Relay, and yeah, a lot of people don't use Relay externally, but we were finally hitting the same problems that a lot of other teams had been hitting up to that point with JavaScript bundle sizes and with styling strategies and how do we make this static and make it faster and data, fetching data and making sure we don't have serial round trips and routing and oh my gosh, routing. So finally we had a bit more empathy for the rest of the community and the way that they were building applications because ours was more aligned with the way that the industry had been guided. Yeah.
Well, it looks fantastic, and I'm really happy that you pulled it off. It's quite a feat, yeah.
Yeah, against all odds.
I have two more questions, so then I'll open it up to audience Q&A. So these are kind of fun questions.
Okay.
While the audience thinks of their questions. Meta. You left Facebook. You did not leave Meta.
That's right. I left
now
right before the
they are
rebrand.
Meta.
Yeah.
Thoughts, please.
Yeah, I thought it was like a big mistake to rename the company to Facebook in all caps. I think if we had renamed it to Meta at that point, that would have made it a bit more sense. Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think look, every company starts out doing one thing, and if you want to be around for a long time, you have to reinvent yourself a bunch of different times. Meta is taking a bet on the metaverse and a bunch of supporting technologies. And I think it makes sense for them. The new logo is kind of cool. The colors are good. I don't feel strongly about it.
Okay. I won't dwindle on that. And the last topic is, of course, AI.
Yeah.
I couldn't let you leave here without talking about artificial intelligence. I mean, what's been happening just the last few weeks has been incredible. So as someone who's been a software engineer for so long and has seen technologies come and go, does this make you excited, fearful, tearful?
Yeah, anyone who knows me knows that I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
So it has me a little bit excited. I think, obviously in the back of my mind, I'm like, oh man, we're all just here to build the machines that are going to replace us. But no, I actually am really optimistic. And the reason is, I think that human progress happens in two situations. One is you take something that can only be done by a small number of people, and you make it so essentially anyone can do it. So this is the opposite of gatekeeping.
We're talking about Pareto here?
We're talking about who?
Pareto distribution. 20% of the people do 80% of the work.
Yeah, maybe. That sounds right. Yeah, I hadn't heard. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Well, this is great. You're going to tell me what the things, because these are just I gave a presentation on this many, many years ago, and I didn't do any research.
No, I mean, obviously, you're talking about empowering people with tools to be more productive as individuals and as small collective.
100%.
Yeah.
So that's that. And, anytime you take something that could only have been done by a select small group of people and you make it so anybody can do it, that's human progress. And then the other case is you take things that need to be done by anyone and you make it so no one needs to do that anymore. AI, and especially the generative AI stuff that we're seeing now, I think is going to empower a lot of people to do a lot of great stuff. And it will be disruptive. But it will make it so that people that previously could not generate their own app icons or write a good pitch for something, they will now have tools to make it so that they are more capable than they were before. And I think that's human progress. I'm more excited about the situations where AI is going to make it so there's a class of things that we don't really enjoy doing that we don't need to do anymore.
Yeah.
But jury's out. We'll see how it happens.
Putting the punch cards into the machine.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't want to do that anymore.
That's progress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, and with that, can we thank Tom for coming tonight?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Ben.
We will now open it up for audience Q&A. So I think we got a couple of mics running around. We got Max up here.
Don't call on Theo. It's going to be really hard. It's going to be a hard question. I'll get ready.
Tom, I appreciate the business focus and lens that you bring to all of your answers. You're looking at technology from the angle of what does the business need, right? You're like, hey, we need a new product. The existing technology stack doesn't work for that. Let's figure out a way to fix that. And I appreciate that. The question I want to ask goes in a completely different direction, which is, what are you up to now?
Oh, it's a good question. Thank you, Max. A number of different things. The boring answer is a little bit of investing and advising, and learning to code again. I like to write code still. I'm just not. Don't pay me to do it in production. You don't want me in the critical path. One of the other things I have been doing though is I've been volunteering with the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. So this is a thing that I've been spending a bunch of time on. My mother was diagnosed with a disease called MS 22 years ago, and it wasn't until I left Facebook that I actually started researching it and thinking about where is this thing going, and can I influence where it goes? So I could give a much longer answer and tell you everything you need to know about myelination and various treatments for secondary progressive multiple sclerosis, but that's one of the big things. And then the other thing is just trying to be a good house husband to my wife, Jess. She's still at Meta, and I'm on her health insurance now, so that's super convenient. And yeah, family time, traveling the world, that kind of stuff.
I hope your mom's doing all right.
Thank you. She's doing well.
Thank you, Max. Any other questions?
You can give it to me.
Mr.
I'll be
Teacher?
kind, I promise. This is an awesome talk, one of the better conversations I've heard about like the history of React and how it ended up where it was,
Thank you.
period. One shift I've noticed, and you touched on it a little bit, was previously one of the values of React was that it was really a library. It was a set of primitives that you could assemble in all sorts of really cool ways that just so happened to own and control your entire DOM in a groundbreaking way.
Yeah.
Something I've noticed over time is it feels like the React core team is shifting away from those core primitives and towards a more holistic approach, where working so closely with Next results in less primitive design, more higher up, like you have to buy into a larger vision before any of these pieces make sense for you. And I'm curious if you noticed this shift. Do you think it started with like Expo and React Native? Where do you think this is going, and how do you generally feel about the trend towards React moving out of the primitive design towards more holistic framework design?
Yeah, it's actually a great question. And I think if you look at where React started, the environment that we wanted to start using it in was very opinionated and built a very different way. And so the first thing that we needed in React were all of these escape hatches. So the only code in there that still blames me is very, very deprecated. It's a function called find DOM node. And what you needed to do all the time at Facebook was find a DOM node and then hook up Facebook's date picker or hook up Facebook's implementation of whatever else. And so in the early days, React had to be very, very environment agnostic. It was like, look, you can bring your own router, you can bring your own jQuery. We literally had, teams would use React for some parts of their page and jQuery plugins for other parts of their page. But what happened over time is, as more and more of the site kind of followed conventions, and we evolved away from having a lot of, sort of variety of ways of doing things, the problems became not necessarily better, but just different. And they all sort of gravitated towards, okay, now that we're doing things this way, what's the next problem to solve? And it's crazy that we see Next 13 or React 18 release as a thing that is like the latest and greatest React. That's been in development for 6 years. It started with something called a fiber rewrite, which was this data structure that was going to enable React to do this sort of like concurrent mode when, right? They literally don't talk about concurrent mode anymore. Now it's just about concurrent features. And I think the reason we've seen this shift is it's actually an evolution of the framework that has shifted from library, which can be used in any context, to framework that actually wants to be more opinionated about how you structure your server and your client. I don't know that it's good or bad, but it's definitely a thing. I think that what's probably more interesting is the new sort of libraries that are cropping up that are like, oh, if you only want this piece, you don't need to use that React or Next or Remix thing. Here's just your this thing. And I think that's where this sort of like library, unopinionated, free, use this here, use this there, evolution will continue to, or like, development will continue to happen. I think React wants to be more and more opinionated because it has ambitious goals around reducing JS bundle size, increasing performance, increasing quality, et cetera. And in order to do that, it needed to change from a thing that didn't care about anything to a thing that cares about a lot more. So it's a real shift that's happened. That's a great question. Thank you.
So speaking about caring about more things, web components, they're a thing. They're a component model. You don't have to ship code for the component model.
Okay, talk generally about web components. I hear you. Cool. So I think there were people on the React team that were very excited about web component support, and there was very few people in the React community that were pushing very hard for web component support. And in fact, all the people that were pushing for web component support in React were employed by Google, and more specifically, they worked on one team. And so I think when the team was prioritizing that work over things that were actually going to help, like, Facebook-specific use cases or open source use cases that were a bit more pressing, there was just a series of like, okay, we'll do it in the next one, we'll do it in the next one. But actually, then I think something else changed, which was the sort of, people started to question whether or not web components was the solution that we wanted. I think if web components is released in 2011, a full-fledged working implementation of web components, it's what every developer wanted at the time. They're like, I want to extend the capabilities of the browser, and I want it to be an easy way to do it across browsers, standardized, et cetera, et cetera. And I think once this third generation of JavaScript libraries came along and taught us that actually, like, what the browser's limiting me to is no longer my limitations. I can do things on top that are going to be just as good or better. I think they sort of missed their opportunity by being a bit too late. I don't even know what the state of the web components spec is in terms of adoption everywhere. Admittedly, I'm deep in the React ecosystem, but to have the team that built web components explain to me what their goal was, it was a great goal. They wanted to make it so that anybody had access to the same APIs that browser developers had access to build much more engaging controls, like infinite scrolling lists and date pickers and widgets and all these other things. And by the time it was sort of ready, it was kind of just too late. And maybe some of that's because the standardization process takes a long time and browser support is really hard. Maybe it's because other things were more interesting and took the wind out of their sails. But I don't hear a lot about web components anymore. I also don't hear about the object.observe spec, because when React came along and said, why would we want observation of these data structures? It's so expensive, all the bookkeeping, when we can just favor immutable data structures. Thank you, Lee Byron and Immutable.js. We can favor single directional data flow rather than MVC, where we're constantly updating lots and lots of things. So I just think like the industry and the community and the technologies kind of moved in a little bit of a different direction. And yeah, web components, I think, in a vacuum are great, and in an environment where there's alternatives that are easier and more fun.
Well, I want to point out the
like
major
Rust.
libraries for web components are using a reactive ergonomics now. So
Yeah, everything's changed.
Saw some other hands. Anyone else? Just careful of the camera.
What do you have to say to the folks who, like 3 or 4 years ago, built an application in React using class components, and then now that feels super old, and they started using hooks, and is hooks like the final destination, or are we going to have to rewrite everything again in a couple years?
No, hooks is it. I mean, I don't know. Don't quote me, because use effect is still a pain in the ass. But
That was next on my topic list.
Yeah. Yeah. So class components, I think, made a lot of sense, especially in a world where we were using classes for a lot of other stuff. But I think long term, we always wanted what we called stateful functional components. So even in early versions of React, you could build stateless functional components. So as long as you didn't need to use state and you were just a pure function of your props, you could use a function instead of a class and that would work. And everybody's like, oh, I wish I could just do that, but then also have state. Can I do that? And then we like built a solution. People were like, this is crazy. Why did you do that? But I think we always wanted stateful functional components, which is just hooks, because you get some benefits when you execute your code in multiple different contexts. So the reactive today is significantly more powerful in ways that are probably not really being taken advantage of. But I don't foresee a new, again, I'm not on the team anymore, so do I want to say it? I think hooks are here to stay. I think you're fine. Yeah. The thing that will replace hooks will be the thing that replaces React. So hopefully that's React, but I don't know that it'll be a new way of making components. Also, class components are still fine in a number of ways. And all of those APIs that are very easy to grep for and very easy to read, they're still pretty easy to use. So don't feel bad about having a bunch of class components. Feel a little bit.
Saw some hands over here. Got the mic coming to you.
In the context of managing a large team writing JavaScript, how did, since you were both before and after the so-called third wave of frameworks, what was the shift that you saw in terms of like productivity, interoperability, code reuse, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think product teams moved quite a bit faster, but the more important thing was it was much easier for us to fix bugs. So I guess that's also product teams moving faster. But I think quality went up quite a bit, especially like in the immediacy after React adoption. We had just a whole class of bugs that no longer happened, and we were able to move a bit faster. And then teams were able to grow a bit more effectively because individuals were able to work on like their pieces without needing to consider the entirety of the application that the context they were in. But in terms of reuse, I think we still had a ton of repetition. I think actually repetition is fine until it causes a problem. And so we would have like, Facebook had like 15 different UI buttons. They were all like the one, So it didn't really prevent teams from inventing their own solutions, but it did help them move faster, and I think with higher quality.
Any other questions?
Denny?
I put my hand up a few times there and I was like, oh, okay, not me.
We'll get to you.
I was going to ask a question about, so mobile and web, fairly ossified right now. I know we have some bridging solutions like React Native and some attempts at React Native Web. Where do you see, like there's clearly limitations with web platforms. How do you see us like bridging that gap and building web platforms as, an app versus, a document?
Yeah, I think, first off, every software developer in the history of software has chased this idea that they can write their code once and then run it in any context, and I just think that's bullshit. I think write once, run anywhere is a bad idea.
Learn once.
Learn once,
Right.
write everywhere, on the other hand, is I think what I would probably emphasize. So the idea that you can use a consistent set of technologies, your IDE, a consistent set of business logic APIs, a consistent data fetching strategy. Let's say that you could use TRPC in your mobile app, even if the application code on the client is different between your iOS app, your Android app, and your website. I think that's probably a net good place to be. I think the web is unique in its sort of offering and the capabilities that it has and like what it enables us to do, how fast you can move, how you don't need to download a binary offline. And then, I think there's a ton of amazing things about the web. I think they'll always be amazing about the web. I think apps have a bunch of amazing things about them. Ideally, I would have loved to see a world where the browser just gets better because certain websites are enhanced with native device capabilities. As of now, our two big mobile operating system authors are not excited about that, but that's where I would like to see it go. That said, the most important thing when you're building an experience for a device is considering the device. The person who's using your app on iOS is not using that app in the context of your app on web and your app on Android. They're using it in the context of a bunch of other apps, including platforms, native platform first-party apps on iOS. And the person using your app on Android is using it in the context of a bunch of other Android apps. So the fact that you feel good about the fact that your app looks exactly the same on web and iOS and Android means nothing. It should feel at home in the context that the person who's using it is using it. And I think, solutions like React Native will get you closer, but it's not free. You have to care. And that's the one thing that can't be replaced by technology is giving a shit.
What a good place to close. Can we give it up for Tom, everyone?
Thank you. Let's give it up for Ben and our host, A16Z. Thank you.